Welcome to my updated Magus deck profile for the premium format. So this is actually based on the list I used a few months back in France during the premium BCS events. But I've been sort of tinkering around it ever since, and I've been trying out some interesting stuff with it. So I wanted to kind of do a follow-up deck profile since there are some fresh ideas here. So to start with, we've got our starting Vanguard, which is Semilunar Magus, just to get the draw 2. I've even tried builds where you play like Lozenge Magus you start and maybe have these in your main deck, but I was kind of worried about being grade stuck, so in the end I went for this. Plus, because the format right now is very heavily force based, you've got a lot of 10k bases in the game right now, and because of that issue, whenever you Semilunar to boost and you swing under as a result because you're boosting a 9k, you basically have risks where just to get those draws, you're basically ruining your rush, which kind of defeats the purpose of a grade 2 game, which then gives less value to these sort of plays. So Semilunar Magus is a really good card, but due to the nature of force decks existing in the format, this card is not quite as good due to that, because in a way, your opponent, especially a Steam Maiden player, because Steam Maiden is quite a popular deck right now, they basically profit from it. So that's why I'm just limiting this to being the main deck starter, sorry, the normal starter with none in the main deck. Next, 4 copies of Pentagonal Maguses. Obviously, you can play Hexagon if you want. She's quite handy as a high roll card, or if the game goes into grade stalling and you see an opportunity. But obviously, there are decks that play Rollox, there are decks that play Heal Guardians that can reduce crits. So generally, if your opponent's like, say, 1 damage, it's not very good, this card. But if your opponent's on high damage, you've got potentially 3 attacks that can be lethals, because if you get just a few crits, you can then pass those crits to your rear guard that restands, which is Cubic Magus. So she can be handy. Next we have Facility Magus. She kind of works quite easily. You can ride this by accident, or you can just call this to rear, and you always have that extra drive check, which is nice. Very good with Momo as well. Obviously, see my other deck profile if you want to have a bit more sort of in-depth discussion on like other things that the deck does, but I'm going to be kind of going through this a bit faster this time. 4 copies of Cubic Magus because it's your main restander. Also, just to let you know, this works on Vanguard as well. So if you do get your 6 Magus on the field, you can actually restand this card as your Vanguard and swing twice while gaining a drive check every time. So you do 1 drive, restand, and then drive again. Compare that to Regalia, which is another deck I play. Regalia has that same gimmick because of Ruijisa, which can call Seer Yggdrasil, and you can call the Norn behind your Vanguard. But difference is that Norn takes away 1 drive check. This card doesn't take away the drive check. So this kind of has an advantage of a Norn, but obviously 6 Maguses, especially in the early game, being set up on the field is a bit of a challenge. That doesn't always happen. But then there's also the issue with gaining power, because one of the card's weaknesses, actually, this card's weakness, is that she doesn't even gain any power. So if you compare this to Seer Yggdrasil and Norn, usually they swing for 23. This card swings for 9k. And obviously the booster only works for like 1 battle, whereas Norn gives 10k to the unit that she boosted at the end of the bout, and then you restand the unit. So you're basically able to keep on gaining power for like 2 attacks. This card can't do it, so it relies so much on other cards being able to provide the power-ups, which is what we're going to get into soon. Obviously you've got triggers as well. Then there's 2 copies of Stellar Magus. She's a good ride. You sort of do want to play some grade 2s because the other 2 cards, quite often you prefer not to ride them as well. So in a way, Stellar Magus kind of makes you feel a bit better, and also because Rectangle doesn't do anything if you ride it. So if you can find another grade 2 and then just ride it and then call this, you can always play more than 2 Stellars if you want to. It does make it a bit more reliable in terms of actually calling grade 2s to rear. And obviously with Semilunar, you're enabling, well, they enable each other so that you can actually draw as well. So you can choose which one you want to activate. Another thing is as well is that if you don't use this card, you can just use Cubic Magus to basically just soul charge it and get that plus that you're owed as well. Next, 4 copies of Rectangle Magus. This is just handy for rush and stacking basically. She's kind of there to help with a bit of aggro. Very handy in that stage of the game. Then we have 3 copies of Tetramagus. So Tetramagus is quite good, but obviously you have to be on grade 3 or greater to use the skill. So you don't really want to draw so much just too fast into the early game, but you also do want to see it at some point. So 4 might be too many, arguably. At least if you're competing for room with other cards, which is what we're doing here. We do want to play other stuff because Magus does have a lot to offer. So this is a non-Magus, and I'm playing 3 copies of Will Crane. So this is the special spice card. Basically, OTT is surprising, it doesn't actually have that many cards that can give power to another rearguard. And so Will Crane, I think is probably the better one for this deck. You can use cards like Balthus Panatone, which is the promo, which has been reprinted in Clan Collection, or was it Clan Selection? Basically, Balsister Pantone is moves into Soul, which this card also does, and then you basically look at top two. You place one on top, one on bottom, and then the next trigger you get is plus 10. So obviously, if you fail to get trigger, then Pantone is useless. Whereas this card guarantees a 10k power. But there's actually other reasons to play this over Panatone. So firstly, Magus has a lot of drawing in the first place, and this card triggers when you draw. Secondly, has a 6k base, which can be useful if you accidentally misride this. Obviously, 6k rides. I don't think I need to explain like why 6k rides are decent options to have. Obviously, that's not really what you're trying to do, but it's a thing. And also, she gives, this card, I don't know what gender it is, gives 10k to the front row. So not front row, rear guards only. So you can't give to Vanguard, which isn't as important, but you can give to another rear guard, which means that even if your cubic Magus attack isn't enough, at least your other rear guard can then force out more guard. Because let's just say, suppose your opponent's on full damage, right? You get like 2 crits in your drive check. You give all the power-ups to the restanding cubic Magus, and then you have these 2 crits. You decide, okay, rather than giving all the crits to one restanding rear guard, you want to maybe give a crit to your cubic Magus and to your other rear guard. However, had it been Panatone, you would have only given 10k to the cubic Magus had you gotten the trigger, right? But with Will Crane, you're giving 10k to the other rear as well, which Panatone can't do. So that's kind of one of the reasons why I prefer this over Balthus Panatone within the Magus deck as well. Obviously though, Pantone is very easy to time because it's an act skill, whereas this is an auto trigger when you draw a card, but Magus is quite a bit, so you just have to play this deck quite well to actually make this better. But the numbers do make a difference, because when you've got cards like Ichikishima, which guard restricts, when you've got grade 3 heals existing, which can actually guard against Ichikishima rear guards, and obviously grade 1 cards with 10k shield can work as well as that, and 5k grade 2s and so on, there is quite a bit of guard that can float around that can guard against your rear guards. And so pushing for the bigger numbers, but then also making it so that your other rear guard can also be an extra additional threat whenever your opponent actually manages to build better hand, is really handy, and that's how you can kind of close in the gap against the top decks of the game. So Will Crane is a very good card. I think it's definitely one to consider in Magus. I've personally been having a lot of fun using this. 4 copies of Cure Magus. This is to enable your semi-lunars, but also to just know what's on top of your deck. Also rearrange stacks and so on. Obviously you can use like Psychic Bird to draw the non-trigger as well if it's a non-trigger. There's all kinds of reasons to use this. It's just handy utility, and also setting up your damage checks in the early game. 4 copies of Cone Magus. So this deck actually has a weakness, which is that the shield quality sucks, and this is one of the reasons why it's a 5k. So compare it to Battle Sisters. Battle Sisters has really high guard quality, whereas Magus is actually not as good. But Cone Magus is so good as a countercharger because it's on place rather than, unlike Battle Sister, which is basically shuffle into your deck, so you neg a Muffin out, but you're putting a crit back in, which is decent. At the same time though, it does mean you're playing more 5k power criticals, and Psychic Bird is also a very good card, so you do kind of, either you have to make them compete for the slots, or you decide to play more 5k triggers, so there is that downside as well. Whereas at least this is taking up a normal unit slot, but it's also just handy with Semi-Lunar as well, and it's an instant counter charge, whereas Muffin is on attack. So obviously timings matter, because if you've played Battle Scissors, you probably know that if you use a counter boss in the early game for a card like, say, Battle Scissors Trifle, and then your opponent decides to damage your next turn after you attempt to rush them by calling rear guards, then you can't use any of your Battle Scissors grade 3s because they require counterblast, one of which is on place. The other is basically an axe skill, so you can't do it in time for the Muffin. So the Muffin does basically conflict with your grade 3s in a way if your opponent knows how to play around Battle Sisters. Then we play 1 copy of Elementaria Sanctitude, which is basically a useful one-off Blitz Order. The trigger lineup is going to get a bit strange, but basically 1 over trigger, obviously. Thing is, you do get this quite a lot with Magus because OCT is very good at checking over triggers. Only thing is that they're not very good at finishing the game with over triggers. So just because you see an OT doesn't mean you're going to win, but you will see it more often. Then there is 3 copies of Draw PGs. So I opted to play Draw Perfect Guards because, well, over triggers exist in the game for one thing. Secondly, there are actually numbers that end up being a bit too high, and I decided maybe I'll go for this. Also, there's an advantage to this, which is that you are able to then filter and find your units to call. So draws are decent when you've got a card that requires 6 Magus on the field. Also, you're not really trying to crit like that insanely. It's more of a multi-attack deck, so just getting the odd crit or so is still quite decent. So it's not like the worst thing in the world, I don't think. 4 copies of Celestial Witch Toto, so you can stride, of course. And then 4 copies of Psychic Bird, so you can soul charge and draw. And then lastly, 4 grade 3 heals, and then onto the main deck, sorry, the G zone. Karmu Susano, this is just so you can recover when you're being rushed out and you have no hand left. The thing is any stride is actually good with Cubic Magus, which is one of the things I love about this deck, because Cubic Magus doesn't care what stride is, it's going to multi-attack. Next we have 4 Ichikishimas, which is quite good as well, because you can guard restrict with it. And then we've got 2 copies of Sterling Witch Momo. Very good restander. This is one of the other cards that can give power to Cubic Magus. Obviously, it just means you can't use other strides, but 30k is very good. Obviously, if your opponent deals you enough damage, or you have enough Cone Maguses, you can then make it so you have Cubic Maguses that attack for 69k. Wait, yeah, 30k with Momo, and maybe like another 30k from some triggers that you drive checked. But if you have Facile Magus, you can give this more drive, so you can go from 4 to 2 or 5 to 3, and so on. So obviously it's a bit of an awkward setup because your opponent plays like Bermuda Reindeer, and this is probably why I'm not sure about playing this actually. In terms of the format right now, I think Reindeer is a bit of a dodgy matchup, because if they aggro you hard, your deck it needs pieces basically to function. Otherwise you're just way too behind. And as I mentioned, the guard quality of this deck isn't as good as something like Battle Sisters, which is why I think in the current format I feel like Battle Sisters is probably the better deck. However, if the game does slow down, like just a few things get slapped down, maybe like Reindeer for example, then I think this deck wouldn't have as much of an issue with holding onto its pieces and actually playing the game as it's supposed to. So very good card. Also, just because you gain more drives doesn't mean your hand quality is actually getting better, because you do end up having to commit awkwardly and then you're discarding usually good cards. Because think about it, if you're having to call cards onto the field to give yourself a drive check, you're already losing cards from your hand, and then you're also just saying your actual rear guards and so on, or any of the pieces you need to excel like Code Magus, right? So then what you end up left with is probably heal triggers and perfect guards more often than a deck like say Battle Sister, where Battle Sister you just ride from edge, you draw 2 instantly, and now you've got more hand space, and you can usually in Battle Sisters you can quite often just get rid of some weak shields, as opposed to Magus, where usually in Magus you actually end up discarding good quality cards because you've not been given much of a choice after committing units onto the board. Then 2 copies of Dragon King, because this is a card that can actually recover when you're losing. So let's just say Reindeer or whatever ends up aggroing you. Well, this card's better than nothing. It's not as often going to be always enough, but it makes it so you can at least do something. Now, you do need to trigger quite hard if you want to give power, obviously, because Momo gives power regardless, but this card you kind of have to work for that power because you need to check quite well. I think this card though is better than the Susano deck, to be honest. After trying all these different Oracle Think Tank lists, I'm convinced this card is much stronger in Susano than it is in other Oracle Think Tank decks. Then we've got Lozenge Magus Apex, which is basically a CB1 check top 2, add 1 to hand, 1 to bomb. This deck doesn't play Amaterasu, it doesn't play Ichikishima in the main deck, so you don't really care as much about revealing. So if you do just want to find some good shields and you only need 15k to guard, and maybe you're not really looking for a damage trigger, this is quite a good one to go into. And then we've got 2 copies of Amaterasu. It's a free G-Guard, you soul charge as well. Then 2 copies of Bavroy, so you can try and find triggers while drawing cards at the same time. And also Octagonal Magus, which is good if you know what top card is. But if you don't know the top card of your deck and you might need to gamble, you can always gamble for the ideal scenario and just like hope that the card is the right grade, and then you just end up having that big shield that you needed while also plussing the hand size that you need at the same time. Alternative, you can always just go for the middle ground, maybe just guess like say grade 1 and 2 to draw it, and then maybe if it's like a trigger, okay, you can damage check it if it's grade 0. If it's grade 3, it might be a grade 3 heal, you can damage check that as well. So that's kind of the thinking on how you can like do some interesting plays with this card sometimes. But that's more or less it with my Magus deck profile. So yeah, I hope you found that interesting, and basically yeah, this is the main card of the deck, and is quite this is a very underrated card. It's in the Misaki char deck. I have tons of these lying around actually. But yeah, it's good. And I've got like a whole bunch of foils as well. So until then, I will see you guys later. I'll be heading off to LA very soon. This is literally the night before, so yeah, this is probably the list I might be using at Worlds. Maybe, we'll see. Until then, later. Bye.